Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a list of 10 books that I think deserve more hype on Booktube. And on Booktube specifically, some of these books aren't really hyped anywhere, and then some of them are hyped outside of Booktube, but Booktube itself doesn't seem to know that these exist as much as certain other really popular works. Most of the books on this list are going to be fantasy, as that's what I primarily read, but there will be a couple of nonfiction books mentioned, and then also I wanted to mention a fantasy manga, which is the one I'm going to start with. I told all of you when I read this that this is going to be the new thing that I don't shut up about because it's so good, and that would be Hat Atelier. So the setup for this story leads you to believe it's going to be a very sweet, wholesome, cute story that follows this young girl named Coco who just wants to learn more about magic. And when you're first starting, that is the plot, but then the more you get into it, the more that this book actually becomes quite, or I should say this manga series becomes quite philosophical, and it brings up so many important questions that you absolutely are not expecting when you first start it. But at the same time, there is this nice juxtaposition of the wonder-filled mind of a child and also the adults who had that mindset when they were young, but then the world kind of has hardened them and they're still trying to both preserve that wonder for children, to teach them, but then also to help them become adults themselves and to recognize the world for what it is and to have to learn how to make difficult decisions and how to learn how to use their own mind to try to change the world for the better. So you do have the sets of characters where some of them are children and they're very innocent and cute and sweet and precious, and then you have some of these adults who initially also seem sweet, but the more you get to know them, the more you realize that some of it is for the sake of the children, and there's a lot of darker, more sinister things going on in the world. So I can't recommend it enough. It is so good. And on top of all of that, even if you just want to pick it up for the art alone, you won't be disappointed because this is probably the most beautiful, stunning art that I've seen in a manga. It's just panel after panel of the most breathtaking art. She's very creative with the character design and the clothing they wear. The landscape is gorgeous. Just everything that she does is amazing. So I can't recommend Hat Atelier enough. Next up, we have A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking. This feels very full circle, as the last time I did this style of video, I asked all of you to let me know your recommendations for books that you think don't get enough hype on Booktube, and one of you mentioned this author, and it felt very serendipitous because at the time that I was replying to comments, I also was trying to order something, and it had in the recommendations, you might also like Tea Kingfisher, and I was like, okay, it's meant to be. So I tried it and I loved it. That book was Nettle and Bone, and ever since then, I feel like that author has blown up on Booktube, and Nettle and Bone has a lot of hype around it. There's also some horror books that she's written, some gothic horror. She's written so many different age ranges and genres that there's pretty much something for everybody, and she as an author has been talked about a lot, but I don't know that this one has gotten quite the hype. This book is delightful. It's so much fun. I have compared it constantly. You already know, probably, if you've watched me talk about it before, that I've compared the tone of it to Shrek, because there are aspects of the humor and some of the jokes that I feel like are very appealing to adults, but then some of it is very over the top and on the nose, but really fun and silly, and definitely one that I think almost middle grade readers could pick up. The main character is a 14-year-old girl who, at the beginning of the story, a body is found in her family's bakery, and then she's suddenly finding herself in the middle of this investigation that involves magic users in their city. She herself is someone who can use magic, but her magic is pretty much limited to things involving baking. It starts as a small, almost murder mystery plot, and then it turns into this really big thing involving the safety of the entire city. It's just such a fun little fantasy standalone. I think the main character is just so endearing. You can't help but love her. And like I said, I just feel like this is a book that so many different ages of people could get so much out of and have so much fun with. And if you're somebody who ever likes to buddy read with your kids, or maybe with nieces and nephews or anything like that, I think this would be such a fun one to do that with. Next up, we have The Art of Prophecy. If you are a fan of Jackie Chan movies, if you like the humor combined with the action, then definitely check this one out. Some of the humor, I've admitted, is sometimes a little extra kind of cheesy and silly, but a lot of it is, I think, within that perfect balance of it's fun and it's ridiculous, and at the same time it's really cool, and the story has such cool action scenes. So I had such a good time with it, but you might have to give it a little bit of time when you first start because the cheesy factor is pretty high. Regardless, the setup for the story is we follow this young man who is at the center of a prophecy. However, because he is at the center of a prophecy, everyone has felt the need to protect him, and it has leaned into overprotection, where he is now suddenly not equipped whatsoever to handle any threats that come his way because he's never really had anybody actually try to train him in a legitimate fashion that might require him to maybe skin his knee sometimes or get bruised a little bit. Everybody is pampering him all the time. And then Q, our mentor figure, coming into the equation and basically telling everybody, what are you doing? You're setting us all up for disaster. I'll take care of this. And she now is trying to harden this prophesied hero so that he's actually prepared. And at first it seems like it's just going to be a little bit of a stereotypical hero's journey, mentor-mentee kind of a story. But what I really liked is we pretty quickly see some of those tropes flipped on their head, and the story goes in a direction that is somewhat unexpected. It's a lot of fun. I feel like it's very vivid when you're reading it, and if you like the action-adventure type of stories with some of the humor and lightheartedness mixed in, then definitely check this one out. Speaking of things that somehow have gone, it feels like, under the radar, because that's how I felt about Art of the Prophecy, next up we have Children of Ragnarok. This one especially feels like it went under the radar. I don't know if it's because a lot of the individuals who have enjoyed this author's works in the past, because she's a young adult fantasy author, I think some of her audience has gotten older and maybe is primarily reading adult fantasy and didn't even know that this book was released. Maybe it was just that the marketing, there wasn't the amount of money that should have been put toward it so that it got put on people's radars, or because it was released around the end of the year of 2022, and around the end of the year, a lot of people are kind of wrapping things up. Regardless, doesn't really matter why it's gone under the radar, but it has. And it's kind of baffling because her other series is a Booktube darling. I think that's why I'm so hyper-focused on this, is it's a Booktube darling. That other quartet, the Seven Realms Quartet, so many people on Booktube will tell you, oh, I really loved that series when I was a teenager, or I got into that one when I was getting back into fantasy and it was just so fun. So it's kind of shocking that Booktube hasn't seemed to have noticed this one as much. But regardless, I think this is a great YA fantasy for people that don't typically read young adult, because I do think the way that she crafts her worlds, the way that she ties you to the characters, you feel very emotionally gripped very quickly. And on top of that, I like the way that she crafts the plot as well. I think she does a great job of combining both an interesting plot and interesting characters. So when you first start the story, you are following a young man who his mother has remarried after his father's death. It's very Viking-inspired world, very Norse mythology-inspired, as I'm sure the title indicates. But regardless, his mother has remarried and this new husband is abusive. She is now pregnant with his child. Her two children, including our main character, were from her previous marriage. And so the new husband, as the kids are getting older and as his child is about to be born, he's realizing that if he eliminates the main character, then the property that they own, that was their family's farm, will then go to his bloodline. And so now our main character very quickly is realizing that he is in danger. He wants to protect his mother, his new baby sibling, his sister, but he doesn't really know what to do. And so it seems like a very intimate, closed sort of plot line when you first start, but from there it expands into something much bigger. I really liked the main characters. I think this author does a great job of writing characters who start out very flawed, but likable, and you can see them growing as they go through various different obstacles in their lives. So I like that they're not perfect characters. I like that they're not so annoying that you can't stand them. They're really well fleshed out, realistic feeling people within a very interesting world that you feel like you're escaping to. I think she also does a great job doing very vivid imagery with her world. So definitely highly recommend Children of Ragnarok. Next up are a couple of our nonfiction books. The first would be Evicted by Matthew Desmond. This is one of my favorite books of all time, not just because I think that he put so much heart and soul into the research that he did, but because of how he was able to craft that information in a way that it's almost like a narrative, it feels like watching a movie or watching a documentary. He's very, very gifted in how he's able to to develop all of this in a way that's very palatable and very easy to read and also very eye-opening. So this is a very, very well-known popular work of nonfiction, but I don't know that a lot of Booktube that is outside the nonfiction corners of Booktube, that they really read a ton of nonfiction. I think a lot of us tend to lean toward memoirs and things like that. But if you have not picked up Evicted, I highly, highly, highly recommend it. As the title, Evicted, implies, this is about the eviction process in America and the way in which people have turned eviction into a thing to make money off of, and how when people are evicted, what that does not only to those people, but to cities in general, and how it's this cycle, how hard it is to pick yourself up after you have gone through eviction. And it also shows the ways in which eviction more so affects certain groups of people than others and why. And it is done so well. Matthew Desmond actually lived around a lot of the people that he interacted with, and he, with their permission, had a tape recorder and he would record everything. So he is taking exact conversations, changing the names of the people for their own security and safety, and then just delivering this information, and he's kind of removing himself from the equation and just having you see these very real people and what they're going through. And like I said, it makes it feel like you're watching a documentary. And actually, at the time I'm filming this, I discovered that Matthew Desmond has another book coming out, and I definitely can't wait for it because I'm sure it's going to be just as well done as this one is. So where Evicted is popular probably more so outside of Booktube, but maybe could be talked about more on Booktube, this next one could just be talked about more in general, and that would be Trailblazer. This one follows the first Black woman in America to be working for the Washington Post, and she is telling her life story and also telling her time at the Washington Post. She's putting a lot of emphasis in her career within journalism and reporting, and the book is structured in a way that I think makes it unusual for those of us who have read memoirs, because a lot of times memoirs go in order of when I was a kid, and then they work their way up through adulthood. And she structures it a little bit different, where she's more focused on certain passages are, here's my life in journalism and reporting, and then also here's my life in general. And at the end, it's sort of a reflection on everything and looking to the future, her hopes, and then also just looking back at her career and reflecting on that. But I think that structure throws people off because it does mean you're kind of covering a large chunk of time, and then you go back and you cover a large chunk of time again. But I didn't mind. I actually kind of liked it broken up that way because it's sort of like the career side of her life and then her life. But regardless, the obstacles that she had to face, to give some examples, at the time that she became a reporter, it was very difficult often for her to even go out onto the field and do reporting because America was still dealing with issues of segregation. So she was putting her life on the line every single time she went to cover a story. And often when she was going to areas where segregation was so much of an issue, she had nowhere to stay. She had nowhere that she could go to sleep and get a good night's rest before going out and doing her reporting. But these were the sorts of things that she felt like she couldn't really complain about. She felt like she couldn't really talk to her boss about, because the more that she presented all these obstacles that were in her way, then the more that the company might feel like, oh, well, if we have to make all these accommodations for her, then maybe it's not worth hiring her. And so she would have to just endure this so she could pave the way for others that came next. And so it's very much an apt title. Trailblazer is, I think, it's a very good, once again, eye-opening book. Getting back into less depressing territory here. Next up, we have the Blade of Secrets duology. The first is Blade of Secrets. The second one is Master of Iron. I think that this is just such a delightful and honestly kind of important duology to have exist, because we have a main character who is someone who very much deals with anxiety to the point that it makes it difficult for her to live a, quote, normal life. She wants to keep to herself. She has not only anxiety about what's going on in the world and in life, but she has a lot of social anxiety, so she's very nervous to interact with others. But her and her sister are on their own, and so it's even more difficult because she doesn't really have that barrier with her parents where they can help her deal with things. She has to take care of her sister and herself, and she does this by being a blacksmith and having a business where she makes magical weapons for people. One day, she makes a magical weapon that is meant for a very important figure, but she discovers some information that leads her to believe that this new weapon she's created would be used for terrible things, and so she goes on the run with her sister, and then they go on basically an adventure. There's a couple of other characters that join them, but I really liked the way that the mental health representation was done. I really liked the bond between her and her sister. You see the way that realistically they sometimes have a hard time understanding each other, but they love each other anyway. So sometimes they fight. Sometimes her sister is her biggest cheerleader and champion. Sometimes she's the biggest thorn in her side. If you're like looking for something that's kind of sweet and fun and adventurous, then I would definitely recommend this one. Next up, we have the book Monsters We Defy. This is a new release from 2022 that I wish had a little more hype around it, as I wish for basically all these books. But this is one that follows a woman in a historical setting, but there are fantastical elements that have to do with curses and boons. And I really like the way that the author did those. It's very almost personal to whoever has the boon. And then, of course, the curse very much changes their lives in ways that they could have never imagined. And so you have this almost ragtag group of people that all come together to try and use their various different gifts, the magical plus side of their deals, to deal with this particular kidnapping situation that's going on, this really weird, bizarre thing that is happening to some of the people within this one city. Our main character is kind of the one that is leading this group. I always describe it as feeling like a cozy heist because of the way that you're introduced to all the characters, but then also this mission that they're all coming together to try and overcome, if you will. So I had so much fun with this one. I think the historical fantasy setting was really interesting. I really liked, it's essentially an alternate history, so I really liked that aspect of it. I liked the way that we got introduced to all the characters. I liked the way it almost felt like short stories, and I was immediately connected to so many of them. There's also a little romance subplot that I thought was really cute and really sweet. So there's just so much about this that I think made it a very enjoyable, and to use the word cozy again, cozy read. After that, we have Arrows of the Queen. I actually am specifically going to recommend the first book within this trilogy. Mercedes Lackey is an older author. This was first published in the 80s, and I think that a fair amount of us don't really go back and read fantasy from that time unless it's on the best of fantasy lists, and generally speaking, you don't find a lot of Mercedes Lackey on those lists. You kind of see the same old over and over again, and so I wish that more people would at least try these out, because when I read this, I saw how this has influenced so many of the fantasy books that came in the 90s and that a lot of us ended up growing up with, or that we have gone back and read now. So for example, Robin Hobb. There's so much about Robin Hobb's Farseer trilogy that I think was very much influenced by things within this. The first book, though, the reason I am specifically recommending that one is because it is just so wholesome and sweet and very much ahead of its time in so many different ways. We follow this young girl whose dream is to be a herald, but she currently is living within a very abusive, not only home, but town. And they end up losing control over her when she is picked to become a herald, and she goes into training to become one. And from there, you're seeing this young girl who has been abused, who has never known what it is to trust other people, especially adults. You're seeing now all these adults work together, and also some of the other students work together to befriend her, to help her, to foster learning. And it's so lovely to see. And I wish, like I said, that first book, I just feel like so many people would get so much out of it. It's really, really lovely, and it's also really, really short. Last for today would be If You Could See the Sun. This one was interesting. So the setup for the story is we follow this girl who is top of her class. She is absolutely brilliant. There's only one other individual at her school who even comes close to matching her intelligence, and she sees this person essentially as her rival. But she also envies this person because their family has so much wealth. It's very expensive to go to the school that she is going to, and her family is really struggling to afford being able to have her in this school. There's a lot of commentary on status and class and the kind of opportunities afforded to you as a result of money rather than merit and intelligence. So I really appreciated that commentary. But our main character is also very amusing and silly and ridiculous, and there's also a very interesting aspect to the story in that randomly one day she turns invisible. And then she comes back to no longer being invisible and she thinks, what just happened? And then she realizes that maybe if she pairs up with the other smart kid, the rich kid, who has some connections when it comes to tech, that maybe she can create this app where she can become almost like a private investigator and use her invisibility to discover dirt on people so that she can make money, so that she can keep going to this school. And that all sounds bizarre, I'm sure, and it is, and you really just have to go with it because, you know, you might be asking like, well, how does the app work exactly? Or wait, how does she go invisible? If you're going to read this book, you can't ask those questions. You just got to be like, this is what happens. It's kind of not the point of the book. It's just a what-if scenario. How much when we are in situations where we are not afforded the same opportunities in life, despite working just as hard, if not harder, then what are we willing to sacrifice? At what point do our morals come second to our passion and the things that we want in life and the people that we love and want to protect? Because there is a lot that she has dealt with, not only in her own life, but that her parents have dealt with, and she loves them and she just wants the best for them. So I think it handled a lot of those things really well, but in a very engaging, creative, interesting way. I had a lot of fun with this book. I think a lot of other people would be very entertained, but also appreciate the commentary as well. That's it for some books that I think deserve more hype on Booktube. Definitely let me know what books you think deserve more hype here. I would love to see them. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.